I wanted to start actually by asking you where you were in 1996. You hadn't started at the Stockholm Resilience Institute then, had you?
No, I had not. 1996, then I'm at Stockholm University. I'm actually finalizing my PhD at the time. So I have one foot in Niger, together with the French Research Institute that was still at the time called Rockstrom, but is now IRD, the Institute for Research and Development. And I was doing field research with the very famous soil scientist Christian Valentin, and doing water harvesting, water resilience research with small-scale farmers in Niger, and finalizing my PhD at Stockholm University, which was defended basically defended the year that the forum was born at Stockholm University, and after that I took off to Kenya and took on a research program there on water harvesting. So,
right.
I was quite hands-on at the time.
Yeah, definitely. And which year did you actually go to the center, to the Stockholm Resilience Center? Because you became director in 2006, but you'd been there quite a bit before.
Yeah, so what happened is that I was at a Dutch research institute called UNESCO IHE in Delft. And as part of being a senior lecturer there at UNESCO IHE and in water resources research, I was based at the University of Zimbabwe for some time. And in 2004, Bert Bolin, the famous Bert
Yes.
Bolin, who was the creator of the IPCC, called me and said, in his very humble but straightforward way, "Dear Johan, I think it's time for you to come home." and what he meant by that is that he was then chairing the Stockholm Environment Institute, and they were looking for a new director for SEI. So actually, what brought me home to Sweden was to take on the directorship of Stockholm Environment Institute, following on Roger Kaspersen's leadership. And 2 years into my tenure as heading the Stockholm Environment Institute, we established the Stockholm Resilience Center in 2006. And since then, I had then a 10-year phase leading the Stockholm Resilience Center, and then phasing over to the Potsdam Institute here, where I'm right now.
So one of the things that we're looking at in this 25 years is the degree to which science, the whole scientific endeavor, has been changing during those 25 years and has actually made such a massive contribution to the ways in which decisions are taken today and the politics is moved forward and so on. Can you, in your mind, can you characterize how different it is now to think about the underpinning science than it was back in the late 90s, early part of this century? Can you feel the sort of difference now in terms of the contribution that science makes?
Oh yes, I mean the journey since the early 1990s until today has been and continues to be dramatic, and it's almost like a Copernican moment in this period, because remember that in 1996 we were still in the second round of the IPCC. So the IPCC is still basically establishing itself. It's not until 2001 that we have the third assessment, which is the first really big major conclusion on the unequivocal human cause behind climate change. But you should remember also that it's in the 1980s that the Global Environmental Change Research Programs are born. So the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, IGBP, is born in the mid-1980s. The World Climate Research Program, which is basically the science behind large parts of the IPCC, is also born there in the 80s, 90s. The International Human Dimensions Program, Diversitas, comes in 1990. And then they pursue their disciplinary sciences and make tremendous advancements in our understanding of how the physics of the Earth system works, the biology, ecology, hydrology, but also social sciences. But it's not until we come to 2006, 2007, that for the first time, a synthesis of all these insights are put together by the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, led by Will Steffen, actually, which gives us the conclusion that we have entered a whole new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. So, you know, the first time a scientific paper on what is called the Great Acceleration, you know, mapping out all the hockey sticks, you know, not only carbon dioxide, but also, you know them all. I mean, loss of biodiversity, pollutants of air, sulfates, overfishing, etc. That whole synthesis, it's so easy to forget that it's quite recent, actually. It's not until 2006, 2007 that it's published. It's not until, you know, several years later that the idea that Paul Crutzen established in 2002, this idea that we may have become a geological force of change, we've now become the dominant force of change, was just an idea that he put out in 2002, but it wasn't confirmed until basically 2008, 2009, and actually hasn't been formalized yet. I mean, even now in 2021, it's not yet even kind of formalized as a geological era, but be formalizing it. So during these 25 years, you've seen this extraordinary advancements, not only advancements in science, in our understanding of how our planet is a self-regulating complex systems where the living systems, the biology, the biosphere interacts with the chemistry and physics of ice sheets, of atmosphere, of oceans, but also that we've seen this just very, very dramatic exponential rise in unsustainable pressures on the planet. And that has occurred right in this period, right in the last 30 years. So, and I always get quite frustrated by that, because people, you know, come back all the time saying, but you scientists, you've been warning forever. You know, we remember the limits to growth in 1972, and you've been just shouting and warning, and nothing really happens. Well, that's not true, because actually the 1970s and 1980s, they were really early warnings. They were insightful early warnings, but well before we had the evidence. We did not have the evidence in place. These were more, you know, risks we were facing. It was more like almost you could call them hypotheses. You know, Rachel Carson was warning something that she felt intuitively. It wasn't that the hard data was really in place with regards to the planetary scale. Today, just in the last 20, 25 years, we have the data in place. So when the IPCC fifth assessment comes out in 2013, and now the sixth assessment coming out now 2021, 2022, it's a completely different story, because we're sitting on this mountain of observations, of analytics, of modeling data, which gives us a completely different confidence level that we've never had before. So yes, it is a different it's a different chapter.
Yeah, no, I think it's an extraordinary shift, to be honest, during that time. As a non-scientist, a layperson, I think back to the ways in which so much of the debate in those early days was speculative. It was people looking at models. It wasn't people processing empirical data. So it could be contested on the basis that it was all still up in the air with nothing actually firmly landed. And the whole debate, I think, was in some respects contaminated by that lack of really hard-edged data. People could play on the doubts and the uncertainties and the fact that scientists were necessarily coming up with diverging ideas as to what all of that represented and what it meant for humankind. But I'm interested, Johan, from your position now, whether you think the politicians who are kind of processing all of this science, theoretically, whether you think they have actually understood that shift, that they have got themselves now in a frame of mind where nobody's dealing really with sort of uncertain hypotheses. They're actually now being invited to base decision-making on hard-edged reality. Do you see that in the politicians that you're coming into contact with?
Well, actually, my assessment today is that the answer is yes and no. There is a yes there, and the yes is that I really think that citizens, politicians, business leaders, it has sunk in that there is an uncomfortable sense that our current, economic paradigm and the development pathways we're following are causing negative impacts. They have risks associated with them, and that we have a problem. Basically, that I think is quite well understood across the board, actually, and we see this confirmed in opinion polls, led by Tony Lizerovitz and his colleagues at Yale University. And we did quite recently a poll across all the G20 countries by Ipsos, showing a remarkably high 70% of citizens being concerned even of risks of tipping points. So, which surprised even me, actually, that high number. Now, so I think there is a base understanding which is much, much higher than ever before, which is why we see political steps like the Fit for 55 and the Green Deal and the Biden administration actually taking on courageous decisions of net zero. So that I think is good. But the no is more problematic, that I don't see literally any signs of political leadership in the world understanding that we're talking of a crisis, that we're talking of approaching tipping points that could push the planet irreversibly to drift away in a direction that will leave all future generations with a planet that just slides towards less and less livable conditions. And that we've come to this crunch point, that we have been struggling for better parts of 50 years, but particularly the last 25, 30 years. And today we've come to the end of the road, that when science today says, look here, dear friends, we have a global carbon budget remaining, which is so limited that it's almost ridiculously small. It's actually so small that you can talk of it just being, just the last little crumbles on the table. I mean, 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide when we emit 42 each year. I mean, it's less than a decade remaining in a fossil fuel driven world economy. It's a drama. It's a transformative moment. It's about exponentials back into a safe space. And that is not understood. I mean, it is as if the world has understood, but still thinks that somehow there's a way out of this through muddling along incremental efficiency, linear pathways that does not, under any circumstances, rock the boat on our current wealth creation model, so to say. So somehow everyone loves, there is some fix here on green growth and decoupling, and we try to recycle a bit better and reduce some waste, and suddenly you have the buzzwords of stop eating meat and you save the planet, basically, or there's some quick fixes here or quick fixes there. That, I think, is a symptom of not understanding that this is a systems problem, that science is showing that we've come to, that I talk about a saturation point. We've filled up the whole space. We're hitting the ceiling of the entire planet's capacity to remain stable, to support humanity, and that this is not understood. So it's like a mixed picture today, and there's a lot of positives, but it hasn't really sunk in properly that it's such a decisive moment, and it's a very difficult communication to make. I mean, just look at the IPCC that concludes. I mean, no media has picked that up, but the IPCC, the conservative baseline, I mean, it's such a carefully crafted document because it's the consensus across the entire scientific community, concludes with a very high likelihood. Very high likelihood means very strong scientific confidence that even at 1.5 degrees Celsius, even if we are able to land at 1.5, we will be committing all future generations to at least 2 meters sea level rise. I mean, it won't happen this century. It will take probably 2,000 years, but it's unstoppable. Yeah, it will just continue. And I would say, well, from a moral perspective, if you think of intergenerational justice, you would say pull the brakes, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, strictly speaking.
So just sticking with that point, because I think it is such an interesting point, and I agree with you that the media don't really seem to have got their heads around this from the assessment report, that came, the Code Red report, as described by Jonathon Porritt. When the whole Planetary Boundaries framework was launched back in 2009, you and colleagues then were using language about the risk of irreversible and abrupt environmental change. And I can remember that word, irreversible, having really significant symbolic and physical meaning at that time. But some pushback on that, because people said these systems are much more flexible, and what makes it one system irreversible one moment, et cetera, et cetera. It was pretty shocking to see that the IPCC report, the assessment report, is now talking about these changes being, some of these changes, sea level and ocean acidification, being irreversible over hundreds or even thousands of years, which is the phrase that they use.
Yeah.
It is an absolutely shocking moment in the unfolding story, the narrative about climate change, which just doesn't seem to have got the attention that it should have done.
You're absolutely right. And of course, I can say, and my Planetary Boundaries science colleagues can say that, well, so the IPCC report 2021 basically confirms what we said already in 2009. It confirms the planetary boundary assessment. It confirms that tipping points are not only real risks, but cross them, and we commit all future generations to irreversible changes. That means not necessarily a collapse down an escarpment overnight, but it means a drift towards less livable conditions, which means getting tougher and tougher and tougher on extreme events, on food insecurity, on all types of social instabilities. That's one of the biggest concerns I have also, that we may come to that, you know, for too long we've allowed these questions to be environmental issues when they're not. In fact, they're all about our kind of our human future. It's about security, wealth, and development. But that's, I mean, you've been and are the big master of leading on that front. But that's also something that concerns me, that we've still really turned the corner on that. But you're right that, you know, with the, I mean, one of the dilemmas I see is that media and political leadership rely increasingly on science for decision making, which is positive, but they rely essentially not only, but to a large extent on the IPCC. So we have a very climate tilt discussion politically, and it's based essentially only on the IPCC, not recognizing what the IPCC is. I mean, the IPCC is, I mean, the last time we had a report is 8 years ago,
yeah.
And the sixth assessment comes now, and it has a deadline for publications to be allowed in, which the date went out already 2 years ago. Yeah. So it's already 2 years behind, and it's the minimum common denominator across an incredibly wide scientific community. So the IPCC is beautiful as the baseline, as the floor we stand on, but it's certainly not surprising, therefore, that the criticism you can make on the IPCC over its 6 assessments is that it has, you know, underestimated risks. It has underestimated the pace of change. It has time and time again had to, you know, adjust its sea level rise predictions, adjust its temperature predictions, adjust climate sensitivity, adjust, as this time, the risks of what they talk of irreversible commitments and risk of tipping points. So, you know, but I'm not surprised. On the contrary, I think it's exactly what we need. I mean, it's obvious that the world needs that the fundamental confidence that comes from the IPCC. But then on top of that, you have such an enormous variety of sciences, like the frontier on tipping points research, like the frontier on planetary boundary science. I mean, it's interesting that in 2009, we warned about tipping points, confirmed in 2021, the IPCC. 2009, we said that the climate planetary boundary is actually a bit below 1.5 degrees Celsius, because we see so much science that go beyond. We put that at roughly 1.2, 1.3. We start seeing irreversibilities, more or less confirmed in the 6th assessment, that we start seeing these changes, commitments, irreversibilities occurring so much earlier. So, you know, when we met in Paris, very few scientists even could talk of 1.5 being a climate planetary boundary. I mean, I did, and John Schellenhuber did, and a few others. Today, any climate scientist would say, yes, that's it. I mean, 1.5 is not some kind of compromise, political compromise with low-lying island states. It's a physically based planetary boundary. You know, it's a temperature way outside of the Holocene range. It's actually the warmest temperature on Earth over the last 100,000 years, as concluded even by the IPCC today. But we've been saying that for a long time. Paleoclimatic research has been saying it for decades. You know, you have this wonderful program called PAGES, which is a scientific paleoclimatic community under the Global Environmental Change Programs. You know, you Google PAGES and look at their papers, they can show you that over the past 3 million years, we've not passed 2 degrees Celsius. You know, we have so much knowledge, but of course, what funnels through the basic platform of the IPCC is a slightly different story, and media and political leaders must understand that, which they don't.
Yeah. Just thinking of you, Johan, personally, sitting there with your colleagues in the Potsdam Institute, reflecting on all of this, how is it for your scientific colleagues coping with this? I mean, it must be extraordinary. And I have personally, in the last year, 18 months, had some incredible personal encounters with scientists where they have been, in effect, emotionally distraught at what is progressively being revealed to non-scientists, and are finding this emotional burden harder and harder. Of course, maintaining, you know, everything that you might expect in terms of scientific balance, et cetera, but actually in themselves now beginning to wonder just how awful this is going to be for humankind, and being as shocked as any other person anywhere on the planet. How does that feel for you and your colleagues right now?
You know, I must admit that it is challenging, and it is causing more and more, let's say, concern within the scientific community and within an institute like the Potsdam Institute. As you can imagine, what happens is that my scientific colleagues at the Institute increasingly feel the necessity to kind of step out and engage more actively, you know, in demonstrations, in different policy engagements, in having broader societal impact. And with the whole youth movement and the Fridays for Future, for example, which has been, as you know, one of the, let's say, epicenters for the Fridays for Future movement is in Berlin. So Berlin is one of these boiling hotspots of change, and the Potsdam Institute plays a very central role here in Germany. And the first time the Fridays for Future had a global demonstration was in Berlin. Immediately after the demonstrations, I had a little electric car pick up Greta Thunberg and Luisa Neubauer, because it was quite fantastic. They wanted to do one thing, and that was to come up to the Telegrafenberg, to the Potsdam Institute, and meet the scientists. And I said, you're more than welcome. And the only purpose for that was that typically Greta Thunberg, they wanted just to fill up with the latest science. And as a little anecdote, I agreed to this under one condition, which was no media, that they were only allowed to come if they could just sneak in and have a seminar with Stefan Rahmstorf, Ricardo Winkelmann, some of my leading glaciologists and ocean scientists, and we all agreed, but somehow it leaked. and you can't, I mean, we've had heads of state visiting PIC over the years, but I've never seen as many journalists and kind of like a paparazzi crowd up this beautiful Telegrafenberg as when Greta Thunberg and Luisa Neubauer was coming. So I completely failed to keep the journalists out, but in the end, I was able to hold them outside of the institute, and we had this engagement with the youth. But all of this to say that yes, we have continuous dialogues within the Institute among scientific colleagues. What do we do? How do we act best as scientists to accelerate the pace of change? And I can tell you that that's not easy, because on the one hand, and I tend to hold that position, I think we as academics have to be very careful, because we have to continuously ensure actors in society that we are trusted sources of objective information, that they should be able to trust the research results that we share. So we cannot risk ourselves to become too deeply embedded in political ideologies and different activist movements. On the other hand, we cannot sit and just publish our papers. So we have to find this balance. And I think we have quite a nice balance today. And I have so many scientists that are engaged in the Science for Future. I am myself providing all support that the youth movement wants behind the scenes. I mean, just informally, under the radar, just all the time being as active as we ever can. And yes, there is a sense of frustration and irritation in many. I've just published a paper by colleagues in the social sciences at the Potsdam Institute, showing that just with the current coal-fire plan in the world, we would eat up the remaining global carbon budget. And findings like that just makes things just go black. I mean, it's really, really bad. So of course you have to have therapy sessions with colleagues to just walk through how do we act at this stage. But to close this, to say that so far, at least, I think the science community's reactions are dominated by the willingness to fight, rather than this risk of just falling into kind of a depressive mode. It is rather frustration, which is guiding me more than passiveness. But yes, it is. It's not easy.
Yeah. Is there a taboo on people saying it's too late?
It's not taboo. There are scientists saying that it is too late, but it's not in the mainstream of the scientific community. It's certainly not adopted or not applied. I mean, nobody hinders you to do that, and you have a few scientists who do that, and you may have seen that there was quite recently quite a debate that emerged from Australia with the Australian Climate Council. They came out with a report that basically concluded the 1.5 Paris limit is lost, that we should give that up. And that was heavily criticized by other climate scientists. And we at the Potsdam Institute, we have actually different scholars coming to different conclusions. But overall, we've said that the window is still open, even though it's shutting very fast. And the big drama is really about the nature carbon sinks and about aerosols. But physically speaking, it seems still possible. But social science-wise, it seems very unlikely, because geopolitically we don't see any signs of delivering on those promises. So so it's not that it's taboo, but it's not welcomed.
Yeah, it's an incredible dynamic going on, isn't it? I mean, it really is, because it's so nuanced, and there are such important things riding on this, the implications of this, on continuing to message all of this in the right way and be true to the science.
Exactly.
And yet allow people to feel some of that despair that is creeping up without claiming that that's an inappropriate response to what we now know. I mean, it is very, very delicate. And the difficulty is people love to just simplify this into black and white stuff, which doesn't really help anybody very much at all. On which, Johan, because one of the areas where there's a lot of the controversy resides is in this notion now of net zero carbon and what the hell net means, and the degree to which the net zero by 2050 movement is taking comfort from the suggestion that we will be able to remove billions of tons of CO2 from the atmosphere to maintain some kind of stable climate, even having gone over the limit. And you'd have to say that that some of the bodies responsible for these for that conclusion, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, our own committee on climate change here in the UK, we're now wondering whether or not this sort of taking refuge in the notion of net zero with the prospect of billions and billions of tons of removals every year, whether that is just an additional confusing factor for people. How, because you've done so much work on the land use side of stuff as well, with all your work with the EAT Foundation and elsewhere, the land use side is where so much of this destiny, as it were, is going to be worked out. Not so much in the tech side of things any longer, but on the land use side of things. Where are you now on that whole notion of net zero?
Yeah, it's a very, very important issue and very complex. And let me start by saying that, which connects the net zero with our previous discussion. You know, I'm quite genuinely nervous, and that's why I try always to be very clear, to put all the cards on the table on even communicating catastrophic risk, because what I'm really afraid of is that even us in the scientific community tend to come across with our communication as a kind of a feel, with lending people to a relaxed feel good factor, that we are underplaying the risks on purpose, which I think will hit back on us very hard, because you can imagine the disappointment in society and say, oh my God, if you knew all this, why didn't you tell us clearly that we were completely ruining the system? And one of those areas where I feel that we have not been very honest with the world is on net zero, because what has happened, as you know, is that, you know, the only reason why we have a remaining global carbon budget is that we have factored into all the climate models massive negative emissions from mid-century onwards. Your point about, you know, it's 8, 9, 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide removed per year from 2050 onwards. The only reason why we have a remaining carbon budget is that we assume that forests, soils, all the natural ecosystems and oceans will just continue to absorb carbon dioxide. And then we even assume that agriculture will go from what it is today, a major source, actually the single largest source in the world, 25% of emissions coming from agriculture and forestry, to becoming a sink. So in a way, the only reason why the IPCC can give us a carbon budget is that we've built in these quite academic assumptions of massive withdrawals. That's even before we come to net, by the way. These are just basic massive withdrawals. And we don't have a solid evidence that we will be able to deliver those. So that's, I mean, you could to turn it around. If we start losing emissions from forests and soils and natural ecosystems, there is no carbon budget remaining. Then we have to shut down the fossil fuel driven world economy today. And so it's that's the magnitude of the delivery from nature. So this worries me a lot, that we have kind of built into these scenarios, as they're called, so many assumptions on negative emissions. And on top of that, we have the net problematique. And what is the net problematique? Well, the net problematique actually originates from this analysis, which I think you could argue is correct. I mean, we have been doing it to a large extent in the Potsdam Institute, saying that even if we are very, very successful in reducing emissions from natural gas, oil, and coal, there will be a residual remaining by 2050. We will have roughly 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year from aviation, from shipping, from steel industry, from the difficult to abate industries. And that will have to be compensated through a net negative, hopefully a like for like, meaning that if it is burning fossil fuels, it has to be absorbed as CCS technologies. So that would, I think, potentially work if it was scaled. And that becomes the strict definition of net. Therefore, my conclusion is that we have no choice. We have to accept net whether we like it or not. I would obviously have wanted to avoid net. I mean, just absolute zero as fast as possible. But I think we have no choice because I cannot see any realism in absolute zero. That said, it's misused today. It's misused as a kind of an offsetting strategy to say that, well, net, I can apply that much earlier than my landing zone in 2050 to say that, well, I'm not really able to reduce my emissions in the pace that science says, so I'll plant some trees and I'll call that an offsetting to help me become a net reducer of emissions. That is complete greenwashing, and it doesn't work, and it's simply violating both the policy and the science and the reality. So it's a misused term. I mean, it should be used only in that landing zone, the final residual. You know, you try to clean your house, and there will always be one little dust portion in a corner that you can't get rid of. That's the net part. That should be the net part, but it isn't. It's simply allowed to grow up to become this massive, buffer source, which is really a really big concern.
Yeah, it is a huge concern, and I'm not sure. Looking at the run-in to COP26 in Glasgow in 2 or 3 weeks' time, I'm not sure that any of this stuff is going to be hunted down in Glasgow. People are really going to try and land this.
Yeah.
How are you facing up to the possibility that Glasgow is not quite going to do what it really should be doing?
Yeah, I must share with you that I feel that my journey to Glasgow has been like a roller coaster, because asked me a year back, I was actually quite enthusiastic. I felt the UK government was really showing, we're going to make this not only the most significant COP since Paris, but also the nature climate COP. But then I haven't really seen the leadership come out, and now I feel very nervous, to be honest, about the Glasgow COP. Nervous because, just the following, which is quite remarkable that it isn't out in the media more. The Paris Climate Agreement is a legally binding agreement. It's signed by all countries in the world, and in that legally binding text, it says that 5 years after Paris, all countries are obliged legally to upgrade their NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, according to science. So they have to align their plans to science. And what has happened since Paris, where we have the 1.5 report and we have this assessment. So we know now, as we've just been discussing, unequivocally that we need to have, zero emissions in 30 years' time, cutting emissions, which was very inspiring, actually, because there's clearly among the senior staff a very deep understanding that there's so much at stake in Glasgow, and this is the moment to get the whole, let's say, planetary boundaries or resilience or nature carbon sink agenda right into the climate negotiation. So, who knows? It might some positives might come up, but I think there's real reason for concern. Yeah.
Actually, I'm really heartened to hear that, Johan, especially in terms of the realization that the nature climate story hasn't come alive in the run-up to COP26. It's not really been very much part of the preliminary discussions. And there's very limited public understanding of this. People still see the biodiversity and ecosystem stuff proceeding down one avenue and then the climate stuff down another with different conferences and all the rest of it. So we're still way off the pace in terms of actually understanding those linkages. And that is something that absolutely has to be landed in Glasgow. If we're going to move forward on this, it really does need to happen, which I think is so important. I mean, it's intriguing to hear you talk of a meeting like that with officials from a government department here in the UK. I mean, you do spend quite a lot of time trying to bring politicians and civil servants and those who are commenting on the reality of climate change. You spend a lot of time trying to get people to move on, to keep the mind alive, be true to what is happening in the world today. But I've never seen you as a particularly political person, Johan. I've never sort of, when I think about you and the incredible contribution you've made over the last 20, 30 years, it's not something that jumps off the page as in, woof, this guy, Johan, he's got right into the bowels of the politics of all of this and helped to sort things out. How do you manage that balance yourself personally? Because people look to you to help steer politicians, but you yourself are not what I would call a political animal.
Yeah, well, coming from you, whom I admire more than most, I'm really happy for that assessment, actually, because I'm walking a fine line, and I come back to my earlier statement that I personally have taken the decision that I think that the biggest value I can offer the world is the independent advice as a scholar to policy, to business, to civil society, whoever wants to listen, school kids in school, but to be considered a trusted independent source. But at the same time, you're right. I over the years have become more and more kind of pulled into the corridors of power, but also increasingly, actually, the boardrooms of big companies to provide scientific advice, and I do that as a sense of obligation, and I really must emphasize that obligation, because what I'm passionate about, and we know each other well enough that it will come as no surprise. I mean, my passion is really to work with my PhD students, my MSc students, my postdocs, and publish new research findings. I mean, right now we're actually working on the third update of our Planetary Boundaries science, and nothing keeps me so engaged as advancing the latest runs of our Earth system models to get the interactions between the planetary boundary quantifications right. So, but all that said, I mean, it is, I think today, this is my way of handling the crisis we're in, the obligation to serve, because I'm a public servant, and I think we as public servants in academia working on sustainability science have an obligation to serve society, and this is my contribution there. But I try to do it all the time in a way that does not kind of mix the roles as much as I ever can, and so that's probably why I'm really glad that you don't feel that I've kind of been pulled in. I can tell you one little anecdote. We had the elections here in Germany just a week ago, biggest, most decisive climate elections in the history of this country. And one of the chancellor candidates, the Social Democrat, SPD Olaf Scholz, said he wanted to come to Potsdam Institute as part of his election campaign.
Right.
And I said, yes, you're welcome, but we will then immediately invite Armin Laschet and Annalena Baerbock, the two other contendants, so that we anyone should be invited, and we're not preferential to any camp, so to say.
Yeah.
So it is a balancing act. Yes.
Yeah. So Johan, we've only got sort of 5 minutes left. I mean, I want, in the end, thinking we've spent a bit of time looking back and a bit of time looking at where we are now, particularly with COP26 and so on, just thinking ahead. For me, thinking of your role in all of this, at the heart of so many of these really complex global challenges and problems, I'm intrigued to ask, allows you to stay hopeful. And thank you for your candor in answering that question about how hard it is now for you and many scientists to cope with the knowledge that they bear on a day-to-day basis. But when you think about keeping in that place of hope, the safe operating space, I always come back to this notion, which for me is such an important part of the Planetary Boundaries work, this safe operating space for humankind and what it looks like, and the prospects for young people still to be able to thrive in a safe operating space is a critical part of our dialogue, our discourse with young people these days. But as you look at all that, for you personally, what's the thing that allows you to keep that hope alive as you contemplate the next, I'm not going to bother you with 25 years, but the next decade?
Yeah, no, that's a really important question. Let me give you the most important dimension to that and it's it might sound at a very high level, but it's actually absolutely true, something that I pick up from my back pocket probably once every day as a reminder to myself, which is that what really gives me hope today is that, you know, just over the past, well, certainly over the past 30 years, but reinforced over the past 5 years, is that I feel so 100% certain that we have the winning narrative. We're sitting on the winning story. And what I mean by that is that, you know, we have so much evidence that, you know, keeping, well, apart from the evidence that we are putting the planet at risk, we have so much evidence that keeping the planet within a safe operating space gives multiple human benefits. And that these benefits are counted, you know, from the basics on jobs, economy, and security, but also on health and, you know, all parameters that has to do with human dignity and justice. And given that we see such a rapid rise of scalable solutions, which can help us back into safe operating space, and not only that those solutions are not only scalable but are increasingly able to survive on misconstructed markets that continue to subsidize the destroying systems, and still solar and wind and different sustainable options are kind of eating themselves deeper and deeper into our kind of modern metabolism. And so that to me is actually significant, that we're sitting on the winning story. So I sometimes tell my students that, look here, I'm absolutely convinced that the question is not whether or not we'll be able to decarbonize the world economy and come back within a safe operating space. Potentially the biodiversity is the most challenging one, but at least on our decarbonization journey, the question is only, will we do it in time? Will we be too late?
Yeah.
Meaning that I think the journey we're on towards a more sustainable, equitable, prosperous future within a safe operating space is essentially inevitable. It's like we have turned that corner. I mean, you and I know, for example, that we will never be able even to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals unless we close the cycles and become more equitable in sharing the remaining ecological space within planetary boundaries. I mean, it's like a dead end to continue as we do today. So we have the winning story. And I think to me that's something I pick up very often to just remind myself that, look here, in all these uphill battles, remember, we have the winning story. And that big help to me as well personally, because I get continuously attacked by skeptics and denialism and you know, inertia of different kinds. And it's also really nice today to sit with so many good arguments, you know, where we've never had such a toolbox of ammunition to hit back in a very constructive and convincing way. So in that sense, it's hopeful. And then finally, of course, I mean, the typical answer, which I really abide to, I mean, even if we are not able to come at dead center of a safe operating space, we know that every 1/10 of a degree counts. We know that every species counts. We know that every hectare of land counts. We know that, so even having an overshoot period, even failing before we succeed, means that the impacts on our children and their children will be reduced. So it's worth it. I mean, I've never seen any justification for giving up. So there's also hope in the sense that, you know, it's worth struggling. I think you and I have had a discussion once this question of, is really 1.5 the target? Well, I can say today we know it is the target, but even before we knew it was the target, it was still worth aiming for, because if you aim for 1.5, we're very likely to then avoid 2 at least. So even if we end up at 1.7, 1.8, thanks to the fact that we struggled towards 1.5, it made us stay away from 2. But if we give up 1.5, we're more likely to just slide away to 2, and then we can go beyond 2. So, you know, there's something hopeful in the lighthouses, in the knowledge lighthouses we have, and just work towards those as much as we ever can, and then combine that with the winning story. And I think we're, you know, there's good reason to at least never give up, of course, but also to see some light in the tunnel.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a brilliant place to end. I have an image in my mind now of you with your students, talking to them about the winning narrative and why they need to be true to their life mission and to their prospects for the contribution they'll make to this world. I just love that idea of empowering them through the winning narrative, because that is what we have available to us, which is fantastic. So listen, thank you so much. Honestly, that has been such an enjoyable opportunity to catch up with you anyway, which has been long overdue. But so much of what you've just given us in the last hour is just fantastically insightful. So thank you. It's been amazing. It's been really good.
But thank you. I really appreciate this. And you know that, I mean, you've been and you are one of my biggest inspirations in the world. So, I mean, everything that we've been talking about, you've basically been saying it time and time again. So, I mean, it's great to catch up, and we should do that more often.
We should, but not in Glasgow. I'm afraid I'm not going to Glasgow. Are you going? You probably are.
I am, unfortunately, yes. At least that's the plan right now.
Yeah, I know. I thought to myself, you will not be able to avoid going to Glasgow, but I can avoid going to Glasgow, and I am avoiding it. So I won't see you there, but hopefully soon after that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Johan. Yeah. Lovely to spend time with you.
Yeah,
Bye.
Likewise. All the best. Bye there.
Bye.